You see, in the Old Testament, God required animal sacrifices as a part of his worship. And God not only required that animals be sacrificed, but they needed to be unblemished. They needed to be perfect animals. But during the prophet Malachi's time, when the people were bringing animals to worship, they were offering God their second best animals, maybe even their worst animals. In verse 8, God says in verse 8 that they were bringing him animals that were blind and crippled and diseased. This described the quality of the gift that God's people were bringing him. And God says to his people in this passage, this is my paraphrase of what he says. He says, do you think that this type of worship honors me? Bringing me your second best? Giving me your second best shows me that you really don't want to worship me. In fact, you're despising my name by bringing this kind of an offering. You're only worshiping me grudgingly because you have to, not because you want to. Do you think that I'm pleased? I'm not. Do you think that I accept your offerings? I don't. I would rather that the doors to my house be locked than for you to come in here and pretend to honor me. Wow. That's a powerful rebuke from the Lord. Worship had become a burden for God's people. They had to do it all of the time. And they became casual, and they became tired of worship. And it was just a burden for them. And God's message is that it would be better for them to not go to worship than to come to worship half-hearted, than to come to worship begrudgingly. You know, giving God our second best is an attitude that's still alive and well today. Around Thanksgiving back in the early 1990s, radio commentator Paul Harvey shared this story of a woman and her frozen Thanksgiving turkey. The Butterball Company every year around Thanksgiving sets up a phone hotline to answer questions as people are preparing their holiday turkeys. And one woman called in to inquire about cooking a turkey that she had found in the bottom of her freezer, and it had been there for 23 years. 23 years. The Butterball representative told the caller that the turkey would probably be safe to eat if the freezer had been below zero for the whole 23 years. But the representative went on to warn the woman that even if the turkey was safe to eat, the flavor would probably have deteriorated to the point where she wouldn't recommend eating it. The caller was quiet for a second and replied, "That's what I thought. We'll give the turkey to our church." This woman would have made a good Israelite, wouldn't she, during the time of Malachi? She was quick to give God her leftovers, her second best. And the message of this passage is clear. God deserves only the best that we have to offer. And this is especially true in our worship. If we want to honor God with our worship, if we want to please God with our coming together, then we must give him our best, especially in our worship. We must never offer God our leftover time, our leftover energy, our leftover attention. If we do, we will be repeating the same sin that the worshipers in Malachi chapter 1 did, who didn't give God anything of value. It was what they had left over. What we give God, the quality of our gift, reflects our attitude toward him. The quality of what we bring to God in worship reflects our attitude toward God. And so, how do we come to church on Sunday morning for worship? Are we rested and ready to give God our best? Are we tired after a late night Saturday? Who gets our best energy and time? Is it God or our friends on Saturday? Does God get the first fruits of our income, or do we give him what we have left after we've bought what we wanted. When we sing to the Lord, does God get a heartfelt offering, or do we just endure while others sing? When prayers are offered, do we participate, or is our mind wandering on the things that we're going to do later in the day? When we come to worship God, what is our attitude? Is coming to worship a burden? Do we come grudgingly? Or are we glad to give God our best? What we give God in response to his presence reflects our attitude toward him. God wants us to understand this, and that he doesn't want our leftovers. He wants us to understand that. God was angry with his people in the time of Malachi, and he will be angry with us if we give him our second best. True heartfelt worship is when we come to God and we say, Lord, I give you the best that I have. Take my life and use it for your purposes. I am yours. This is the offering that God desires. In the Old Testament, God desired unblemished lambs. In the New Testament worship, in our worship, God wants righteous lambs. He wants you and me. Romans 12:1 says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Offering ourselves, our very selves to God. So in view of this verse in Romans, if we really want to worship God, we don't give him just 10% of our money or just 1 hour of worship on Sunday morning. If we really want to worship God, we give him our whole lives. That is our spiritual act of worship. Romans 12 tells us that to take our bodies and offer them to God, to take our lives, everything that we do, the ordinary work in our homes, our factories, our offices, our classrooms, everything that we do, and offer it to God as an act of worship. Do everything as if you were doing it for Jesus. And when you do that, you're worshiping God all of the time. Worshiping God is an every moment activity when we do it as unto the Lord. Now, don't get me wrong. God wants us to gather on Sunday morning, and he wants us to worship. He tells us to not forsake meeting together. But let's not confine our worship to just Sunday morning. For while it's true that we can say, I'm going to church on Sunday morning to worship God, we can also say, I'm going to work to worship God. I'm going to school to worship God. I'm going to do the dishes and worship God. Whatever we do, if we do it unto the Lord, it's an act of worship. It's offering ourselves as living sacrifices to the Lord. And so worship is us responding to God's presence. We can do that here in many different ways, and we can do that as we leave the sanctuary. So let's worship God now as we sing, and then let's leave the sanctuary and continue to worship God all week long.